The morning sun stretched its golden fingers across the Nevada desert, touching the distant ridges with warmth that made the sand shimmer like tiny diamonds. 12-year-old Ava Mercer had been awake for hours, as she always was, long before most of the town stirred. She carried her battered binoculars, a sketchbook bursting with jet drawings, and a small backpack with pencils, snacks, and a hand-built emergency band radio, a device she had tinkered with for months, scavenging parts from discarded electronics and old ham radios. To anyone passing by, she was just another curious child wandering the vast expanse of desert near Nellis Air Force Base, a place where military jets screamed overhead daily. But Ava's eyes didn't wander aimlessly. They followed, studied, and memorized every detail of the sky above. Ava crouched behind a small dune, scanning the horizon. Her ears picked up the faint rumble that heralded the arrival of an F-22 Raptor. She had watched dozens of them before, sketched them from every angle, memorized their sound patterns, even timing their takeoff and landing sequences. She loved the way the jet seemed almost alive, slicing through the sky like a living predator. Today, however, there was an unusual tension in the air, something she couldn't put a name to yet. The first streak of silver cut across the horizon, engines roaring, and Ava's heart leaped. She raised her binoculars, focusing on the details she had learned from hours of observation. The cockpit canopy gleamed, the wings flexed with each maneuver, and the sunlight reflected off the titanium body. She traced the jet's movements, noting the smooth arcs and sudden sharp turns. Her sketchbook came out and she quickly drew the F-22, adding annotations in the margins. Engine sounds, angle of attack, thrust vectors. Her handwriting was messy but precise, a combination of frantic observation and intense concentration. Suddenly, the jet tilted slightly in a way Ava had never seen before. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she noticed it immediately. Her pulse quickened. The Raptor began to wobble in midair, the wings trembling as if fighting an invisible force. Ava's instincts screamed danger. She leaned closer to her binoculars, adjusting the focus. Smoke wasn't yet visible, but the shift in trajectory was wrong, dead wrong. Every book she had studied, every simulation she had memorized, told her this wasn't a normal maneuver. Ava's thoughts raced, her mind calculating possibilities in seconds. She remembered reading about aerodynamic stalls, vector thrust failures, and emergency procedures for F-22s. Every scenario she had imagined during her solitary study sessions suddenly became real. The jet's nose dipped slightly, then corrected itself, but the correction wasn't clean. Ava felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Something was seriously wrong. From the edge of the desert, a group of tourists pointed cameras toward the sky, unaware of the danger unfolding above. A military convoy rumbled nearby, the soldiers pausing to glance at the distant F-22 as it moved irregularly. Their expressions were puzzled but unalarmed. After all, even minor anomalies in flight paths were routine. Yet Ava didn't have the luxury of calm observation. She could see it clearly. The jet was not just struggling, it was failing. The F-22 tilted sharply, and for the first time a thin wisp of smoke appeared near the rear engine. Ava's heart pounded violently in her chest. She pressed the binoculars closer, analyzing every flicker of the exhaust plume. In her notebook, she quickly scribbled calculations: the jet's altitude, estimated speed, angle of descent. Her hand shook, but she didn't stop. Every second counted. A sudden gust of wind kicked up dust around her, stinging her eyes. She blinked, shook it off, and adjusted her radio, which she had been testing for weeks. It was small, fragile, and cobbled together from scavenged parts, but Ava knew it could pick up frequencies used in emergencies. Her fingers flew over the knobs and switches, tuning to the open bands she had memorized. She barely understood the complexity of the military communication network, but she knew enough. Something told her she might need it today. The jet wobbled again, and Ava could now see sparks flickering from the underbelly. Panic rose in her chest, but not the kind that made a person freeze. No, this panic sharpened her mind. Every observation she had ever made was now being put to the ultimate test. She crouched lower, scanning the surrounding desert for anything that might help. Her sketches, her calculations, her hours of obsessive study, it all converged into one thought: she might have a chance to help. As the Raptor descended, it began to spin slightly, not in the graceful, controlled roll that F-22 pilots practiced, but in a chaotic, desperate spiral. Ava's breath caught in her throat. She could almost hear the jet straining against itself, fighting gravity and failing systems. Around her, desert wildlife scattered, lizards, birds, even small mammals sensing danger. The hum of distant military vehicles faded into the background as Ava focused entirely on the jet. Then came the moment of decision. Ava gripped her radio tightly, knowing that if she could reach the right frequency, she could communicate, maybe even guide the pilot. She flipped a switch, checked the signal, and spoke into the microphone, her voice trembling. "Raptor 25, your left vector thrust is unstable. Apply differential braking to stabilize your descent." Her words hung in the air. On the ground, a nearby engineer paused mid-step, turning to look at the small girl shouting into a homemade radio. "What is she doing?" he muttered under his breath. No one else could see the danger from her angle, but Ava's eyes were fixed, unblinking, on the spiraling jet. Every twitch, every flicker of smoke, every tilt of the wings was a message she could read, and she intended to act on it. The wind picked up again, blowing sand into her eyes, but she didn't flinch. She continued to observe, calculate, and prepare. She was just a kid, yes, but for the first time, her knowledge, obsession, and courage felt like the difference between life and death. Time slowed. Seconds stretched into eternity. In that moment, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The tourists looked up, puzzled, the soldiers stiffened, and Ava's radio hummed softly in her hands. She had no idea if anyone would hear her, if her words would make any difference, or if the jet was already doomed. But she also had no doubt. She could not stay silent. She had prepared her entire life for this kind of impossible situation, even if she hadn't known it. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the sand and casting long shadows across the desert, Ava's heart pounded not with fear but with a strange, determined clarity. The jet wavered again, smoke trailing, engine straining, and the impossible became clear. This morning was unlike any other. It would be remembered, not because she was just a kid, but because she was about to step into history. And in that split second, as the F-22 spiraled closer to disaster, Ava Mercer's ordinary life collided with the extraordinary. The desert morning, quiet and unremarkable just minutes before, had transformed into a stage where courage, knowledge, and sheer instinct would define the fate of one of the Air Force's most advanced fighters, and perhaps its pilot. Captain Jordan Hale's hands were slick with sweat, clenching the throttle as alarms blared through the cockpit. The F-22 Raptor, one of the most advanced fighter jets in the world, shuddered violently beneath him. Red warning lights flashed in a chaotic rhythm across the instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. Engine output was uneven. Every system that pilots relied on to maintain control had begun to fail simultaneously. This was the nightmare scenario every pilot dreaded, the black box simulation that no one ever hoped to experience in real life. And now it was happening to him. Hale had flown hundreds of missions, mastered the F-22's almost mystical flight envelope, and survived every conceivable training scenario. But nothing in his experience prepared him for the sudden, inexplicable failure that gripped his jet today. The canopy shook as the Raptor tipped to the left, then corrected, then tipped again. The movements were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but each minute adjustment made by the flight control systems was failing. He felt a pit form in his stomach, a mechanical betrayal he could neither reason nor control. On the base's radar screen, the jet appeared as a streak falling faster than anticipated. Ground crews whispered amongst themselves, unsure if the display was malfunctioning. But Hale could feel every second of the descent in his chest, every wobble transmitted through the controls. He tried emergency procedures. Engage vector thrust, stabilize wings, throttle full. His voice came over the radio, calm but urgent. Nothing worked. The jet continued its chaotic dance, spiraling downward. The cockpit was filled with the sound of mechanical stress, alarms, and Hale's own heavy breathing. Smoke began curling from the tailpipe, faint at first, then thicker, smelling of burning metal and fuel. He knew he had seconds, maybe less, to make a decision. Ejection was an option, but the altitude was too low. Too many variables. He risked catastrophic injury or death if he pulled the ejection too soon, and even if he survived, the jet was gone. It was a fine line between survival and catastrophe, a razor's edge that seemed to have no margin for error. Far below, Ava watched from the desert floor, her binoculars focused intently. She saw the subtle tilts, the flickers of smoke, the wobble that indicated a vector thrust lock. Her heart raced. She could see the jet's precise problem before anyone else, a minor but critical mechanical failure causing a cascade of instability. In her mind, the formulas and diagrams she had memorized clicked into place. She understood the pilot's options, what would stabilize the jet, and what might make it spin out of control completely. Stabilize with differential braking, compensate for the left vector thrust, adjust the angle of attack by a fraction of a degree, she whispered to herself, then raised her makeshift radio. Every component of her small device was tested, fragile, and cobbled together, but it worked. She took a deep breath, hands trembling, and spoke into the microphone. Raptor 2-5, apply left differential braking and hold 3 degrees starboard roll. Inside the cockpit, Hale froze. The radio was silent until now. He scanned the frequency. Nothing unusual should be coming through this channel, and yet he heard a voice, confident, precise, almost startling in its clarity. Left differential braking, 3 degrees starboard roll. The instructions were correct, perfectly aligned with what he needed to do. Hesitation could be fatal. His instincts screamed caution, but he realized he had no choice. Following the voice might be his only chance. Hale adjusted the controls, cautiously at first, then more aggressively as the jet responded. The Raptor groaned as it began to correct its trajectory, the nose rising fractionally, the wings stabilizing. The pilot couldn't believe it. It was as if a sixth sense had entered the cockpit, guiding his hands, aligning his judgment with someone else's calculations. He muttered aloud, "Who the hell is this?" No one answered, but the voice continued, calm and insistent. "Steady, 3 degrees, maintain vector." Outside, the desert wind carried the sound of distant engines and murmuring wildlife. But to Ava, the world had narrowed to one focal point, the falling jet. She adjusted her position, eyes never leaving it. Every movement, every shift in smoke or wing angle was a message. She guided Hale through the descent with split-second precision, telling him when to nudge the throttle, when to adjust rudder pressure, when to brace for sudden oscillations. Each instruction was a lifeline, bridging the gap between an advanced fighter jet and the mind of a 12-year-old civilian. Back in the cockpit, Hale's mind raced. He had never trusted anyone like this before. Military discipline and years of training had taught him to rely on himself, on his squadron, on the data feeds from the base. Yet here was an unknown source giving perfect guidance. Each adjustment saved milliseconds, and those milliseconds were the difference between ejecting too early or crashing. The jet began to respond better, wings leveling slightly, the nose climbing fractionally. Hope flickered inside Hale's chest, a fragile flame in the storm of alarms and smoke. But the danger was far from over. One miscalculation, one delay, and everything would end in fire. Hale could feel the jet fighting against him, mechanical systems struggling to respond. The Raptor creaked, a high-pitched whining that pierced the cockpit. He had to act decisively. With trembling hands, he followed another instruction from the mysterious voice. Slowly, agonizingly, the spiraling descent eased. The plane wobbled but no longer spun uncontrollably. The red lights flashed, but the alarms began to quiet as the immediate danger lessened. On the ground, engineers and controllers watched, stunned. The radar trace was improving, something was stabilizing the F-22, something that none of them had controlled. They looked at each other in disbelief. Their eyes searched the desert floor for the source. And there, crouched behind a dune, a small figure held a radio with trembling hands, her eyes wide but focused. A child. A girl. She wasn't part of any official protocol, yet somehow, She had done what decades of military training had not. Give the pilot just enough guidance to survive the worst moments of a near-fatal mechanical failure. Time seemed suspended. Every second stretched into an eternity. Hale adjusted again, following instructions, each one bringing a tiny measure of control back to the jet. The nose aligned with the horizon. Smoke still trailed, but the engine throttled more evenly. The spinning, chaotic fall had slowed. Hale allowed himself to exhale briefly, but he knew better than to relax fully. The jet was damaged, fragile, but alive, and the pilot still depended on guidance from an unknown, improbable source. Ava's heart raced, but she stayed calm outwardly because panic would ruin everything. Her mind calculated, corrected, and adjusted continuously. The jet's descent was now a dance between human intuition and mechanical precision. She guided Hale with exact minute adjustments, never overstepping, never panicking. Each instruction was deliberate, each word measured. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her tiny shoulders, but she refused to let fear control her. This was her moment. Finally, the jet straightened more than it had in minutes. Hale's hands were slick, knuckles white from gripping the controls. His heart still pounded, but he could feel life returning to the Raptor, fragile but present. He glanced around, scanning the sky, searching for the source of the voice. Below, barely visible among dunes and desert scrub, he noticed a figure, small, unassuming, yet impossibly confident. His mind struggled to comprehend. Was this a prank, a miracle? He didn't have time to decide. The F-22, unstable but responsive, was still in the air, and somehow it owed its temporary salvation to a child in the desert. Hale whispered a quiet, almost disbelieving, "Thank you," into the radio. He had no idea if the voice could hear him, if it was listening, or if this was all coincidence. But he knew one thing: the impossible had just occurred. A 12-year-old girl, outside any chain of command, outside any protocol, had just intervened in a near-fatal mechanical emergency aboard one of the Air Force's most advanced fighter jets. And for the first time in his career, he realized that experience, training, and technology could be surpassed by pure observation, intuition, and courage. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching Hale closer to a forced landing, to a controlled descent that was still fraught with danger. But the jet had stopped spiraling. The immediate threat was mitigated, and somewhere in the desert, a child had just become the unlikely savior of an F-22 pilot, a secret hero whose story would ripple silently through the ranks of the Air Force before the world even knew her name. The desert sun climbed higher, painting the sand in harsh, glittering light. Ava Mercer crouched behind a small dune, her makeshift radio clutched tightly in her hands. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the distant thrum of the struggling F-22. Every muscle in her body was taut with focus. She had watched jets all her life, studied aerodynamics obsessively, and memorized open-source flight manuals. But this was no simulation. This was real, and the stakes were life and death. The Raptor continued its chaotic wobble, smoke curling from the tailpipe, alarms blaring, and Hale's voice could almost be heard through the static of the open channel. The F-22 was dangerously low, and each passing second brought it closer to disaster. Ava adjusted the frequency on her fragile radio, praying it would reach the pilot. This radio had never been used in a real emergency. Yet somehow, today it was the lifeline that bridged a 12-year-old girl and one of the Air Force's most advanced fighter jets. Her fingers danced over the dials. The radio hummed softly, amplifying the faint crackle of the jet's distress signals. Ava swallowed hard and leaned closer to speak, her voice trembling but firm. Raptor 2-5, left vector thrust is locked. Adjust differential braking to stabilize. 3 degrees starboard roll. Now. On the other end, Captain Hale froze mid-maneuver. A voice, clear, confident, and impossibly precise, was coming from nowhere. It was not coming from the Air Force channels he expected. It was not a warning from the base or a fellow pilot. It was a child. For a brief moment, he doubted his senses. Could this be interference, a prank? But the instructions were perfect. They aligned exactly with the calculations he had been running internally. Every maneuver needed to counteract the jet's failing systems. Left differential, 3 degrees, hold vector. Ava continued, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. Every phrase was deliberate, every command calculated to correct the jet's chaotic spiral. The Raptor responded. The nose lifted fractionally, wings leveled slightly, and the spin slowed. Hale's hands moved instinctively, following the guidance, each small adjustment regaining seconds, altitude, and control. Inside the Nellie's control tower, alarms continued to blare, but now a different kind of tension filled the room. Controllers and engineers stared at the radar screen which displayed the jet's irregular descent. "Who's giving the commands?" one technician whispered, eyes wide. Another leaned closer to the monitor. "It's coming from the desert." Confused murmurs spread. No civilian had the authorization to communicate with the F-22 in this manner, and yet someone was doing exactly that. Meanwhile, Ava's eyes were fixed on the jet, scanning every detail, the flicker of smoke, the angle of the wings, the subtle twitch of the rudder. She could see the effect her words had on the aircraft. Each correction she instructed stabilized the plane slightly more. She didn't pause to think about the impossibility of what she was doing. She didn't doubt herself. All she could focus on was the Raptor, the pilot, and the fragile thread connecting them. The air around her vibrated with the roar of jet engines and the soft hum of the desert wind. Ava's palms were damp, but her voice remained firm. Throttle steady, minor pitch up, correct for left roll. She adjusted the antenna on her radio slightly, hopping to maintain a clean signal. She had no official training, no authorization, and no one to validate her actions, only knowledge, intuition, and courage. Back in the cockpit, Hale felt the jet respond more predictably. The Raptor was still damaged, still precarious, but it was no longer spiraling toward certain destruction. He followed the commands, trusting the voice even as his mind raced to understand how a child could possibly know so much. "Who? How?" he muttered under his breath. But there was no time for questions. Survival depended on immediate action. In the control tower, tension escalated into disbelief. Security personnel began scanning the desert, searching for the source of the transmission. Engineers attempted to trace the frequency, puzzled by the unexpected signals. Some whispered, "Is this a prank, a hacker?" Others shook their heads in awe, realizing that the calculations being relayed were technically perfect, something almost no civilian could know. But the proof was undeniable. The jet was stabilizing. The pilot was still alive. And the voice came from a small figure on the desert floor. A child. Ava continued issuing instructions with precision. Adjust rudder, stabilize at 2 degrees starboard, maintain current speed. Each phrase was measured, calculated, and perfectly timed. Sweat dripped down her forehead, sand clinging to her skin, but she didn't falter. She could feel the desperation in the jet's movements, the strain in the engine, the faint vibrations signaling mechanical stress. Every detail mattered. Every second counted. The pilot, Hale, was beginning to trust her fully. He followed her guidance exactly, allowing the voice to dictate the final seconds of the jet's descent. The Raptor wavered but held its altitude. The engines roared unevenly, but they roared. Smoke trailed, yes, but the plane responded. Hale's survival, the plane's survival, everything depended on this impossible collaboration between a trained fighter pilot and a 12-year-old girl. Outside, the desert seemed to hold its breath. Even the wildlife paused as if sensing the tension. Ava didn't speak unless necessary, only issuing commands when the jet required them. Each instruction brought Hale a little closer to control, each correction a little closer to life. And yet the impossibility of the situation weighed on her. She was a kid, alone, in the desert, talking to a fighter jet pilot in a life-or-death emergency, and she was succeeding. The radio crackled again. Falcon 1, hold vector, steady rudder, minor pitch correction, 3 degrees. She had begun giving herself a name, quietly in her mind, to anchor her courage. The pilot had no idea who she was, where she was, or how she knew what to do, but the jet obeyed her. Every system responded just enough to give them a fighting chance. Inside the cockpit, Hale whispered a quiet, desperate thank you into the radio. The voice didn't hesitate, didn't falter, and didn't answer. Yet the pilot felt the connection, an unspoken bond that defied explanation. The impossible was happening. The F-22, one of the most sophisticated jets in the world, was being guided to survival by a child who had never flown, never held a cockpit, and never been part of any emergency protocol. In the control tower, the disbelief had reached a peak. Senior officers arrived, rushing toward monitors, scanning signals, trying to locate the source of the instructions. "A civilian, a child," muttered one colonel. "It doesn't make sense, none of this should be possible." Yet every radar blip, every line of telemetry confirmed it. Someone somewhere was guiding the jet perfectly. Someone outside the chain of command, outside military training, was doing exactly what needed to be done. Ava's instructions continued. "Minor throttle adjustment, hold angle correct for left vector thrust." Her voice rang out, unwavering despite exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. Each phrase brought Hale closer to stabilizing the jet. The descent slowed, the Raptor steadied, and the impossible seemed almost achievable. For the first time, the pilot felt a measure of hope. And in that moment, as the sun blazed across the desert and the jet's engines roared in strained but obedient response, the Air Force realized something extraordinary was happening. No one had ever seen anything like this. A 12-year-old girl, armed with nothing but knowledge, courage, and a fragile radio, was saving a fighter jet and its pilot from near-certain disaster. Ava Mercer, unnoticed by the world, had become the unlikeliest hero in the history of the Air Force. Inside the Nellis Air Force Base control tower, a sense of order and precision had always been the law of the land. Every controller, engineer, and officer knew their roles, their responsibilities, and the chain of command. Radios buzzed, monitors displayed every aircraft in the sky, and alarms had specific, practiced meanings. But on this morning, all of that training was thrown into disarray. The radar screen flickered, displaying a red streak descending faster than any F-22 should. Alarms blared relentlessly, a cacophony that made the tower vibrate with tension. Officers barked orders, technicians scurried between consoles, and controllers shouted into their headsets. Everyone was trying to regain control of a situation they had trained to manage, but had never actually faced. Yet amidst the chaos, something far stranger than a technical failure emerged. A voice, clear, calm, and precise, issuing life-saving instructions to the pilot of a spiraling F-22. "What the hell is that?" muttered Lieutenant Commander Reyes, eyes glued to the radar. The voice wasn't part of any emergency drill. It wasn't the base communications system. It wasn't coming from any of the squadron members who could possibly be airborne. And yet, it was providing flawless commands to Captain Hale, guiding the jet through the chaotic spiral that should have ended in disaster. The controllers froze. A hush spread across the room, broken only by the crackle of the radio. Some shook their heads, convinced it must be a technical glitch, interference, or a prank. "We must have a bug in the system," muttered one technician, frantically checking frequencies. "There's no way someone outside the base, someone civilian, could be transmitting on this channel and actually helping the pilot." But the telemetry didn't lie. Each instruction correlated perfectly with the jet's movements. The radar blip straightened slightly after every command. The oscillation decreased. Even the smoke pattern visible from the cameras indicated that the jet's angle and throttle adjustments were effective. Someone somewhere was doing what no one inside the control tower could. And the most unsettling detail, whoever it was, they weren't trained. They weren't supposed to be able to do this. Colonel Andrews, the ranking officer in the tower, stormed into the room, scanning the chaos. "Explain this," he demanded, pointing at the monitor. "Who the hell is guiding that aircraft?" Engineers and controllers exchanged nervous glances, unable to provide a coherent answer. "Sir, it's a civilian. A child," one technician stammered, pointing toward the desert through the tower window. The colonel's eyebrows shot up. "A child," he repeated incredulously. "You're joking." "No, sir," the technician said, voice shaking. "We've traced the signal. It's coming from a small figure on the desert floor. I don't know how, sir, but she's guiding the jet. Silence fell over the room as every officer processed the impossibility of what they were hearing. A child, outside the chain of command, with no training, was communicating directly with a fighter pilot. More than that, she was correcting the jet's failing systems in real time, stabilizing a spiraling F-22. Are you telling me a 12-year-old is controlling the descent of one of our most advanced aircraft? Colonel Andrews asked, voice incredulous but steady. Yes, sir, the technician replied, still pointing toward the desert. I don't understand it either, sir, but the data doesn't lie. The jet is responding exactly to her instructions. The room erupted into a mixture of chaos and awe. Senior officers debated options, engineers scrambled to verify the signal, and controllers attempted to maintain communication with Captain Hale while the child, now codenamed internally as Falcon 1, continued her steady guidance. Radios buzzed with confusion. Technicians ran back and forth, checking the makeshift frequency, questioning the integrity of every system. But every measurement confirmed the same shocking truth. The F-22 was alive because of a child in the desert. Everyone focus, Colonel Andrews shouted, regaining control of his voice amidst the panic. We need to track her location, maintain communication with the pilot, and verify what the hell is happening out there. Someone get security teams mobilized immediately. A team of military personnel sprinted toward the desert, trucks kicking up clouds of dust, their eyes scanning for a tiny figure that had just upended the entire command chain of the Air Force. Meanwhile, back in the tower, the controllers watched every movement of the Raptor, every fluctuation in its telemetry, every correction prompted by the child's voice. They could see the impossible happening in real time. Engineer Marcus Lee whispered to a colleague, barely audible over the alarms. She's actually doing it. Look at the telemetry. Look at how perfectly aligned the maneuvers are. His colleague's mouth dropped open. That's not possible, it shouldn't be. Yes, it should, Lee said quietly, eyes fixed on the radar. But she's reading the jet's behavior perfectly. Every move is calculated. Someone somehow is doing exactly what the pilot needs. The colonel turned toward the communications team. How long until we can verify her identity? Where is she transmitting from? I want confirmation before we start any assumptions about security breaches. A few technicians worked feverishly to triangulate her position. The desert was vast, but the signal strength allowed them to pinpoint a small area near a cluster of dunes. A group of military personnel rushed toward the location with trucks, radios, and equipment, scanning for any sign of life. Meanwhile, Ava, crouched low behind a dune, kept her focus entirely on the Raptor, issuing commands with the precision of a seasoned pilot. She didn't look up. She didn't panic. There was no time for fear. Lives depended on her composure. Inside the tower, murmurs spread. Is it a civilian, a kid? Some officers laughed nervously, others shook their heads in disbelief. It doesn't matter, Colonel Andrews said sharply. She's keeping the pilot alive, that's all that matters right now. We'll deal with the rest later. Ava's voice continued to cut through the static of the emergency frequency. Left vector thrust corrected. Hold 3 degrees starboard roll, minor pitch adjustment now. Every command was deliberate, and the jet responded. Hale followed, trusting the voice completely, knowing that hesitation could cost both him and the aircraft. The control tower watched in stunned silence as the impossible unfolded. Every officer, technician, and controller in the room understood that this was not just a fluke. This was intervention, expertise, courage, and quick thinking, executed by someone who had no formal training, no authority, and yet somehow complete mastery over the crisis at hand. Colonel Andrews finally spoke, his voice tight with tension and awe. God help me, she's saving him. That child is saving him. The pilot's voice came through, shakier now but more controlled. Falcon 1, if you're there, thank you. The tower froze. Everyone heard it. The pilot knew someone was guiding him. The voice on the frequency didn't respond. It didn't need to. The jet was stabilizing. The child had done the impossible, earned the trust of a trained Air Force pilot, defied the protocols of the most advanced military systems in the world, and was actively saving a life. Outside, the dust swirled as the security team sprinted across the desert toward Ava. Trucks screeched to a halt. Soldiers scanned the dunes, searching for the tiny figure orchestrating the miracle from the sand. And there she was, unassuming, focused, and utterly fearless, still speaking into her homemade radio, completely absorbed in guiding the F-22 to safety. Inside the tower, a collective realization swept over everyone. This was history unfolding before their eyes. The impossible, the unbelievable, the unimaginable. It was real. And the center of it all was a 12-year-old girl who had taken command of an emergency none of them thought could be survived. Colonel Andrews shook his head, almost in disbelief. "Alert the base command. This is unprecedented. And someone get me a camera on that kid immediately. I want to know who the hell just saved one of our pilots." But Ava, still unaware of the chaos behind her, didn't stop. She couldn't. The jet still needed guidance. Every command mattered. Every split-second decision could mean life or death. And she had accepted that responsibility fully, without hesitation, without fear. The tower remained silent, eyes glued to monitors and radios. Every officer, every engineer, every controller understood one thing clearly. They were witnessing a child perform an impossible feat. The kind of feat that would be remembered in the annals of the Air Force for decades. And yet, at that moment, the focus was not on glory or recognition. It was on survival. The impossible had a name: Falcon 1. Captain Jordan Hale's hands shook as he gripped the controls of the F-22 Raptor. The plane, one of the Air Force's most advanced jets, was in distress. Alarms blared like an incessant drumbeat, warning lights flashed furiously, and every system seemed to fight against him. His training, extensive as it was, had never prepared him for this. A near-complete system failure at low altitude with only seconds to act. He had tried everything he knew: vector thrust adjustments, throttle modulation, emergency stabilization procedures. Nothing worked. Each attempt only made the jet wobble more violently, tilting dangerously to the left, engines straining, wings flexing under forces that should have shredded the fuselage. Sweat ran down his forehead, mixing with the grime from hours of flight. For the first time in his career, he felt the raw, paralyzing weight of mortality pressing down on him. Then, amid the cacophony of alarms and engine roars, he heard it. A voice, clear and calm, cutting through the chaos. "Left vector thrust corrected, minor pitch adjustment, hold 3 degrees starboard roll." Hale's eyes widened. He scanned the radio, searching for the source. No call sign he recognized, no authorized officer, no squadron member. The voice was impossible. It was precise, accurate, almost unnervingly confident. His military instincts screamed for caution. "Ignore it," he muttered to himself. "It's interference, a glitch." But instinctively he observed the jet's response. The Raptor quivered, then responded slightly to his adjustments, and Hale realized something extraordinary. The voice wasn't wrong. It was right. The decision was terrifying. To trust the voice meant relinquishing control of the jet, following directions without verification. It meant betting his life on an unknown source, an untrained entity. And yet every logical choice he had made had failed. The plane was still in freefall. Time was running out. Hale's gaze snapped back to the radio. "I don't have time for this," he muttered. "I either follow this or I die." He spoke into the headset, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. "Raptor 2-5, following your instructions, proceed." The voice responded immediately, calm and precise. "Throttle steady, adjust rudder 3 degrees starboard correction, maintain current pitch." Hale's hands moved almost automatically, mirroring the directions. Each adjustment stabilized the jet fractionally. The nose lifted, wings leveled slightly, and the chaotic spin slowed. He felt a strange sensation, an odd mix of disbelief and relief. He was trusting a child, someone untrained, to pilot an F-22 through an emergency. It was irrational, impossible, and yet it was working. The Raptor creaked as the engine strained, but they obeyed the commands. Hale's pulse raced as he executed each maneuver with precision, relying entirely on the unknown voice. For the first time, he felt a connection, a thread of trust linking him to someone he could neither see nor verify. The child's words guided his instincts, gave him the timing, the adjustments, and the minute corrections that made the difference between life and death. On the ground, the control tower watched in awe, monitors flickering with telemetry data. The engineers and officers could see the jet responding perfectly to the unknown commands. Colonel Andrews muttered under his breath, "If she can do this from the desert floor, I need her in here yesterday." But it wasn't about protocol. It wasn't about rank. It was about survival. Every officer in the room understood that the pilot's life depended on trust, and trust had come from an unlikely source, a 12-year-old girl. Back in the cockpit, Hale's mind raced. How does she know?" he whispered. He couldn't see her, couldn't know her skill, could only rely on the voice. And yet each instruction was flawless. Minor rudder adjustment, left vector thrust stabilized, maintain starboard correction. The jet moved as if obeying a skilled pilot, yet the pilot was 12 and on the ground. The trust was terrifying, exhilarating, and necessary all at once. Hale began to anticipate her commands, almost thinking ahead to the next adjustment. He had flown with hundreds of pilots, coordinated maneuvers, and relied on years of experience, but never had he experienced this, following the guidance of someone whose life experience barely extended beyond childhood. It was the ultimate exercise in faith, logic, and desperation. Meanwhile, Ava's voice remained unwavering, calm, and deliberate. "Hold 3 degrees starboard, minor pitch up, throttle steady, vector adjustment complete." Her instructions were surgical, precise, and perfectly timed. Hale executed each one flawlessly, feeling the jet respond. The spinning had stopped. The wobble had decreased. The engines, though strained, were stable. And for the first time he dared a cautious glance at the horizon. The desert floor approached, but he knew he could survive. The Raptor still groaned under stress, its systems flickering in warning lights, but the immediate danger had eased. Hale exhaled a long, shaky breath. He had made it through the worst moments of a near-catastrophic failure, guided entirely by the voice of an unseen child. He couldn't comprehend how she had done it, yet he owed her his life. For a fleeting moment, the cockpit was silent except for the low hum of the engines. Hale whispered into the radio, "Who are you?" Ava didn't respond. She didn't need to. The plane was still descending, still fragile, still demanding every ounce of concentration. She continued to issue instructions, precise and calm, keeping the jet stable as it approached the desert. Hale realized something profound. He had never truly trusted anyone so completely. Every pilot relied on their instruments, their training, and their squadron. But in that moment, he trusted someone entirely unknown, entirely untested. The child's calculations, observations, and intuition were flawless. She was guiding him not by rank, not by authority, but by pure understanding and courage. Time seemed to stretch. The descent slowed further, each second meticulously measured. Hale's eyes scanned the instruments, checking each gauge, each fluctuation. And still the voice continued. "Minor roll correction, hold vector, throttle steady, prepare for landing approach." The pilot followed, trusting every word. The jet responded. Smoke trailed less from the engines. Alarms decreased slightly. The plane was no longer fighting him as desperately. It was almost cooperative, almost obedient, guided by instructions from someone he could neither see nor verify, yet whose knowledge eclipsed his own in this critical moment. Hale's pulse steadied slightly, though adrenaline still surged through his veins. The impossible was happening. A child, a civilian, had earned his trust, commanded his attention, and guided one of the most sophisticated jets in the world to stability. He felt awe, gratitude, and disbelief. And above all, he felt hope. Ava continued to issue guidance. Prepare for landing, minor throttle adjustment, maintain angle, keep vector steady. Her voice, calm yet commanding, resonated through the cockpit. Hale's hands moved instinctively. The Raptor responded. The descent, though still precarious, was now controlled. Survival, once a distant hope, now felt achievable. And in that split second, Hale understood. He had just learned the ultimate lesson in trust, courage, and humility. He had relied on someone who, by all conventional measures, should not have been able to help him. And yet, she had saved his life. The desert stretched endlessly, a golden wasteland under the blazing Nevada sun. Dust swirled as the F-22 Raptor descended, each tremor and groan a reminder of how close the aircraft had been to catastrophe. Captain Jordan Hale's hands gripped the controls, muscles taut, heart hammering. He had never trusted anyone like this before. Yet every instruction, every whispered correction over the radio from the unknown voice had worked. The jet was now stable enough for a controlled landing, barely, but stable enough. Ava crouched behind a dune, binoculars in one hand, her makeshift radio in the other. The sweat on her brow mixed with sand, clinging to her skin, but she didn't pause. Her voice, calm and unwavering, cut through the static. Hold vector, maintain pitch, slight throttle adjustment, flare just before the descent ends. Hale's eyes darted to the horizon. The landing strip, rudimentary desert ground cleared for emergencies, was still a few hundred meters ahead. He followed her instructions precisely, adjusting rudder and throttle to match her directions. The Raptor trembled but obeyed. Smoke trailed from the engine, and the metal groaned under stress, yet the plane responded. Hale could hardly believe it. A 12-year-old girl had guided him through nearly certain disaster. In the control tower, every officer and technician held their breath. Radars tracked the jet's trajectory, and monitors displayed the telemetry, showing that the Raptor was finally approaching a survivable landing. Senior officers exchanged looks of disbelief and awe. Colonel Andrews barked into the radio, directing ground support to prepare for immediate assistance. Trucks, fire crews, and medics raced across the desert toward the F-22, unsure whether they would meet a wreck or a miracle. Ava's voice remained calm, precise. Throttle steady. Flare now, hold vector, touch down gently. She could see the moment the wheels made contact with the sand. Dust erupted in a cloud, obscuring the jet, but the Raptor remained upright. Hale carefully guided the jet to a complete stop. The engines whined as they idled, smoke curling faintly into the sky. The impossible had been achieved. The plane, battered but intact, had survived. Hale exhaled, knees weak from adrenaline and relief. He glanced around, scanning the desert floor, trying to locate the mysterious child. He could barely comprehend what had happened. A life-threatening emergency, nearly catastrophic mechanical failure, and he had survived because of a voice, someone he could not see. "Who?" he whispered to himself, almost too stunned to speak aloud. Then the dust cleared. Soldiers and engineers began sprinting toward the source of the transmissions. Trucks screeched to a halt and personnel fanned out, searching the desert dunes. There she was, a small figure, tiny in the vast desert, radio clutched tightly, hair stuck to her forehead, eyes wide but steady. Ava Mercer, 12 years old, had just guided an F-22 through the impossible. Colonel Andrews' eyes widened. That's her," he said, pointing toward the girl. "That's the miracle worker." Security personnel rushed forward, approaching cautiously. Ava didn't flinch, didn't panic. She kept one hand on the radio, her focus still on the jet, until Hale waved at her, signaling it was safe. Only then did she release a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Hale climbed out of the cockpit, legs shaking. Dust clung to his flight suit, sweat streaking his face. He approached Ava slowly, unsure how to interact with someone so small yet so extraordinary. You saved my life," he said, voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Ava looked up, slightly confused. I just told you what to do," she said, voice quiet but calm. I've been studying jets for years. I knew what to do." Hale shook his head, a grin breaking through the tension. "No, you don't understand. I've flown hundreds of missions and I've never experienced anything like this. You didn't just tell me what to do, you guided me. You saved me. You saved the plane. You saved everyone who would have been hurt if we'd crashed." Colonel Andrews stepped forward, a mix of astonishment and admiration in his eyes. "Young lady, do you understand what just happened?" he asked, his voice steady but incredulous. "You just performed something no civilian, no trained professional outside the Air Force has ever done. You've single-handedly saved one of our top pilots and a $150 million aircraft." Ava's eyes widened. She had expected recognition perhaps, but not this. The gravity of the situation hit her like a wave. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the radio. I just did what I thought was right," she said softly. I wanted to help." Hale placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did more than help," he said. "You've done what most of us could only dream of doing. You've saved a life, a plane, and proven something extraordinary. You've earned a name." Colonel Andrews nodded, looking around at his team. "From this day forward, in our records, in our communications, and in our history, you will be known as Falcon 1. The name settled over Ava like sunlight breaking through clouds. She blinked, half in disbelief, half in pride. "Falcon 1, she repeated, testing the sound of it on her tongue. "Yes," Hale said firmly. "A code name for someone who performed the impossible. You earned it, and the Air Force will never forget it." The ground teams reached her, surrounding her with protective formations. Engineers, technicians, and soldiers all wanted to understand how she had done it. They asked questions, but Ava simply smiled, still holding her radio. She had been focused on one thing, the jet. The Raptor, now safe on the desert floor, seemed almost to pulse with life after the ordeal. She had accomplished the impossible. For Hale, the reality sank in slowly. He looked back at the cockpit, the plane that had nearly killed him, and then at the child who had saved him. "I'll never forget this," he whispered, "and neither will anyone in the Air Force." Even the base personnel, hardened professionals who had seen decades of advanced aircraft and training exercises, were in awe. They had witnessed history, a moment where courage, intellect, and observation had transcended age, rank, and protocol. A 12-year-old girl had guided an F-22 through a life-threatening emergency and survived, unscathed, to claim her place in legend. As the dust settled and the emergency crews secured the jet, cameras and sensors captured the moment for official records. Officers whispered among themselves, realizing the extraordinary significance of the event. They had seen a civilian, a child, intervene in a situation that would have been fatal to any ordinary pilot. This was unprecedented, impossible, and real. Ava stood quietly, the weight of the moment settling in. Her hands rested on her radio, now silent. She had acted, saved lives, and yet she didn't feel like a hero, just someone who did what she had to do. But the Air Force saw differently. She had become a legend in a single morning. A name whispered across the desert and inside the towers, Falcon 1. Even as Hale walked her back toward the tower, explaining each instrument she had guided him through, the reality remained. This child had not just participated in history, she had rewritten it. And from this day forward, Falcon 1 would be remembered as the girl who defied the impossible, the unlikeliest hero the Air Force had ever known. The air inside the Nellis Air Force Base briefing room was thick with tension, disbelief, and awe. Captain Jordan Hale, still wearing the smudged remnants of his flight suit, sat across from a panel of senior officers. Their eyes were fixed on him, expressions oscillating between astonishment, incredulity, and professional concern. Every second of his report seemed to defy conventional military understanding. Hale's hands shook slightly as he recounted the events, voice steady but filled with emotion. "Sir, I've flown hundreds of missions," Hale began, "and I've never experienced anything like this. The jet was failing, systems collapsing in seconds, and then she spoke. A child, 12 years old, and she guided me, saved the plane." The panel exchanged skeptical looks. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds, a veteran engineer, leaned forward, tapping a pen against the table. "Captain, are you certain about this? A child, with no training. You followed instructions from a civilian. Hale nodded emphatically. Yes, I didn't see her, I didn't know her. I had no idea who she was, and yet every instruction she gave was precise, correct, and exactly what the jet needed. If I hadn't followed her, I would have crashed. We all would have. The room fell silent. Officers scribbled notes, whispered to each other, and replayed their own understanding of the telemetry and radar data. It was impossible. The protocols, the communication security, the emergency procedures, all of it was being contradicted by a single fact. A 12-year-old girl, a civilian, had guided a fighter jet through near-certain disaster. Colonel Andrews, sitting at the head of the table, rubbed his temples. We need verification. Every system, every channel, every frequency must be checked. We have to understand how this happened. There's no precedent for this. No civilian should be able to do what you describe. Hale leaned back, exhaling. Sir, I know it sounds impossible. I've double-checked every gauge, every instrument. The instructions weren't coming from anyone authorized. And yet, the jet responded perfectly. Every correction, every adjustment, all of it, she got it right. Reynolds shook his head. Then we need to find her, identify her, understand what she knows, how she knows it, and why she was able to do this. The safety and security implications are enormous. Within the hour, a team of military intelligence officers, engineers, and security personnel had traced the radio signal back to a small cluster of dunes in the Nevada desert. Ava Mercer, still clutching her makeshift radio, had been surrounded gently by soldiers and escorted toward the base. She remained calm, slightly bewildered but unafraid. For her, the moment of crisis had passed. She had focused entirely on saving the pilot and the jet. The attention, the awe, and the formal questioning were almost new experiences. The debriefing room was prepared. Ava, escorted by a non-threatening officer, entered with a mixture of curiosity and confidence. Despite her age, she held herself with composure. Her eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Hale, who gave her an encouraging nod. He was still processing the impossibility of the morning, yet he had never felt gratitude so deeply. Colonel Andrews stood, addressing her carefully. Ava, we've been reviewing the events this morning. Can you explain how you guided Captain Hale and saved the F-22? Ava swallowed, taking a breath. I just watched the jet, she said simply. I studied the engines, the wings, the controls. I knew what each system would do. I've been learning about jets for years. I built this radio, and I used it to tell him what to do. One of the engineers raised an eyebrow. You built this radio yourself? Yes, Ava replied. I've been fixing electronics and making small radios for a while. I tested this one for emergencies. I didn't think I'd ever have to use it like this. The room was filled with murmurs of astonishment. Senior officers leaned in, exchanging incredulous glances. Military protocol, decades of research and formal training could not explain what had just happened. A child, completely outside the chain of command, had not only communicated with a fighter pilot, but had also directed precise maneuvers that stabilized a nearly catastrophic emergency. Colonel Andrews addressed the panel. We need to ensure there are no security breaches. Verify the jet, the communications, and every system that was involved. If there's any possibility that a civilian could replicate or disrupt this, we need to know immediately. Meanwhile, Hale spoke up. Sir, with all due respect, the child didn't hack the system. She didn't break any protocol. She observed, calculated, and acted. Every command was correct. Every adjustment saved seconds and lives. It wasn't interference, it was intelligence, observation, and intuition. The intelligence officers leaned forward, scribbling notes. We need a full assessment, one said. We need to understand her process, how she predicted the jet's movements, how she calculated corrections in real time. This is unprecedented. Ava, listening quietly, was asked to demonstrate. She sketched diagrams, pointed out engine responses, and explained how she read subtle indicators like smoke patterns, wing tilt, and rudder movement. Her explanations, while simple in tone, revealed an extraordinary understanding far beyond her years. She described vector thrust, engine stabilization, and differential braking with clarity and precision that astonished even the most senior engineers. Colonel Andrews finally spoke, his voice tinged with admiration and awe. "Miss Mercer, your actions this morning were extraordinary. You have demonstrated skills and understanding that are, frankly, beyond what we expect even from trained pilots. You've earned the code name Falcon 1, and history will remember this day because of you." Hale stepped forward, placing a hand on Ava's shoulder. "You saved my life. You saved the plane. No one could have done what you did. We need to make sure the world knows about Falcon 1, but right now, we need to make sure you're safe and understood. Do you realize how extraordinary this is?" Ava nodded quietly. "I just did what I had to do." The debrief extended for hours. Officers, engineers, and analysts questioned every aspect of her actions, trying to reconcile military protocol with the unprecedented reality of a child's intervention. Every calculation, every observation she made, was verified and found accurate. Each explanation demonstrated not just intelligence but foresight, intuition, and courage. The investigation wasn't just about the jet or the pilot, it was about understanding a phenomenon. How could a 12-year-old analyze real-time flight data, issue precise instructions, and guide a military aircraft to safety without formal training? Every officer, every engineer, every intelligence analyst in the room came to the same conclusion. It shouldn't have been possible. Yet, the evidence was irrefutable. By the end of the day, Falcon 1 had not only saved a pilot and an aircraft, but had also captured the attention and respect of the entire base. Her skill, composure, and ingenuity had turned a near tragedy into a historic event. Colonel Andrews finally concluded, "Miss Mercer, your actions have rewritten what we thought was possible. You have saved lives and you have earned the Air Force's deepest respect. We will continue this investigation, but know this, you are a hero. Falcon 1. Ava's eyes met Hale's. The pilot smiled, exhausted but grateful. She had done what she thought was right, and in doing so she had become a legend. The sun was beginning to set over Nellie's Air Force Base, casting long golden shadows across the desert tarmac. The F-22 Raptor, now secured and inspected by engineers, gleamed under the last rays of sunlight. For Captain Jordan Hale, the relief was almost overwhelming. He had survived what should have been a catastrophic failure, thanks to the actions of a single, unassuming figure, Ava Mercer, now officially codenamed Falcon 1. Inside the base's briefing room, officers and engineers were still in awe. They reviewed the telemetry, analyzed the jet's performance, and replayed every second of the near disaster. Each frame of data reinforced what they already knew. The survival of the aircraft and its pilot was miraculous, impossible even, yet entirely real. And at the center of it all was a 12-year-old girl whose knowledge, intuition, and courage had transcended any protocol, rank, or expectation. Ava stood quietly at the front of the room, radio still in hand, eyes wide as officers whispered in astonishment. She had been briefed, commended, and debriefed multiple times, yet it still felt unreal. The codename Falcon 1 had been bestowed upon her, but she was still just a girl who loved aircraft and electronics. Yet today, she had become something more, a legend in the making. Colonel Andrews, who had witnessed the entire operation from the control tower, approached Ava with a formal nod. "Miss Mercer," he said, his voice steady, "today you have demonstrated courage, brilliance, and presence of mind that few adults, let alone children, could ever hope to show. You saved Captain Hale, you saved the Raptor, and you have rewritten what we thought was possible. You are Falcon 1, and the Air Force is proud to call you one of its own, even if unofficially." Hale, still in his flight suit, stepped forward and shook her small hand. "You were calm, precise, and fearless. You guided me through one of the most dangerous situations I've ever faced. I owe you my life. Thank you, Falcon 1. His eyes were filled with gratitude and something deeper, respect and awe for a child who had achieved what seasoned pilots and engineers could not. For Ava, the attention was overwhelming. Soldiers and engineers who had spent decades working with advanced technology were asking questions, wanting to know exactly how she calculated the corrections, how she predicted the jet's movements, and how she managed to stabilize a spiraling aircraft in real time. She explained her observations simply: watching the jet, reading the instruments, predicting how each system would respond. Her explanations were technical but straightforward, revealing a level of understanding far beyond her years. The Air Force recognized the significance immediately. Plans were drafted to formally document her actions in the official records. Awards, commendations, and recognition from military leadership were discussed. Engineers wanted to study her methods, pilots wanted to learn from her instinctive calculations, and intelligence officers considered the implications for future training programs. A child had demonstrated what decades of experience could not replicate, and her methods were now a blueprint for innovation in crisis management. Even the media eventually caught wind of the story, though the Air Force carefully controlled the narrative. Falcon 1, the 12-year-old who saved an F-22, became a headline in publications across the country. Photos of Ava, shy but confident, with the pilot Hale and the commanding officers, were circulated. Children, students, and aviation enthusiasts marveled at her courage. Her story became a symbol of bravery, intelligence, and the idea that age was no barrier to heroism. Hale himself became an advocate for recognizing her contributions. In interviews, he described the experience: the terror of the spiraling F-22, the impossible precision of the voice guiding him, and the awe of realizing that a 12-year-old girl had saved his life. His testimony lent weight to the legend. Every word reinforced the message. Falcon 1 was real, extraordinary, and unstoppable. Within months, Ava's life began to change. She was invited to speak at aviation programs, STEM initiatives, and leadership events. She met engineers, pilots, and even aerospace innovators who wanted to understand her process. Yet despite the fame and recognition, she remained humble. She always said the same thing: she had done what she thought was right. She had focused on the jet, the pilot, and the immediate crisis, not on accolades or attention. The Air Force also incorporated her methods into their emergency response training. Simulations were designed to teach pilots and engineers how to interpret subtle cues, respond to unexpected variables, and think outside conventional protocols. Falcon 1's intuitive, observation-based approach became a case study in adaptability, creativity, and courage under pressure. Her influence extended far beyond that single rescue. She changed the way the Air Force trained for crisis management. Ava's heroism inspired countless young people around the country. Children who loved aviation, engineering, and electronics looked up to her as proof that curiosity, intelligence, and courage could achieve the impossible. She became a role model, not just for young girls interested in STEM, but for anyone who dreamed of making a difference regardless of age. Her story reminded everyone that bravery is not measured by years, but by action. For Hale, the event remained a deeply personal milestone. Every flight afterward reminded him of the moment a child's courage had saved his life. He often reflected on the trust he had placed in her, the instinctive reliance on her guidance, and the profound lesson: heroes can appear in the most unexpected forms. The legend of Falcon 1 became part of his own narrative, a constant reminder that greatness can come from the unlikeliest of sources. Years later, Falcon 1 would be celebrated in official histories, aviation museums, and Air Force archives. Models of the F-22 involved in the rescue were displayed with plaques honoring her courage. Documentaries captured the story in detail, interviewing Hale, engineers, and officers who witnessed the extraordinary events. Yet through it all, Ava remained grounded, always emphasizing that the jet, the pilot, and her quick thinking together had saved the day. It was never about fame. It was about action, responsibility, and doing the right thing in a moment of crisis. The codename Falcon 1 became legendary, spoken with reverence by pilots, engineers, and officers alike. Children across the country drew sketches of jets and radios, inspired by her ingenuity. STEM programs adopted her story as a teaching tool, illustrating how observation, understanding, and courage can solve problems no technology alone can fix. Her legacy became a blueprint for innovation, bravery, and excellence. And though decades would pass, the story of the girl who saved an F-22 would endure. Every year, pilots and trainees at Nellis Air Force Base retold the tale of Falcon 1, remembering the courage of a child who defied expectations, saved a life, and left an indelible mark on history. Ava Mercer, once an ordinary girl fascinated by jets, became a symbol of extraordinary heroism, proof that true courage knows no age, and that sometimes the smallest figures can make the largest impact. The desert where it had all begun remained quiet as the sun dipped below the horizon. The Raptor rested, its engines cooled, its systems intact, and its pilot forever grateful. And somewhere nearby, Falcon 1 watched, eyes bright with curiosity and determination, ready for whatever challenge might come next. The legend was only beginning.